It's Dr. Amoso. Today we want to talk about a slave trade. We want to look on the reasons why slave trade was abolished, and after that, now we also look on the effects of abolishing a slave trade. Remember, slave trade was abolished in 1807. What were the effects? What were the impacts of abolishing a slave trade? Let's start with the economical effects of abolishing slave trade. Number one, we see that there was development in Africa in terms of productivity of crops such as coffee, cotton, and also timber. So the abolishment of slave trade led to the productivity of crops such as coffee and also other what items such as cotton and also timber. It is said that the productivity of timber increased after the abolishment of slave trade. So this was a positive result or a positive impact of abolishing what slave trade. Another positivity that also came by the abolishment of slave trade was that there was formation of trading companies that bought items and that also sold items. So we see that these companies now they started to operating these companies now. It was a positive result that came as a result of the abolishment of slave trade. We also see that the abolishment of slave trade, it led to the birth of legitimate trade. What is legitimate trade? It was the trade in natural products such as groundnuts, rubber, minerals, palm oil, and also cotton. So we are seeing legitimate trade starting because of the abolishment of slave trade. Another result was also the intensification in terms of hunting ivory. Ivory was now hunted. There was intensification in the hunting of ivory, and by so doing, now we see that it was another positive result that also came by the abolishment of slave trade. But this one now is debatable. You can say it was a positive, or you can say it was a negative. Then another one was the development of mining industry. The mining industry it developed because of the abolishment of a slave trade. There was also a creation of employment. So many Africans they were now employed. So we see the creation of employment starting by the abolishment of slave trade. Another result was the development of infrastructure in Africa. Infrastructural development started to take place in so many areas in Africa. So that on its own, we see that it benefited the Africans. So the Africans benefited with the abolishment of our slave trade. Another one was the introduction of new crops. New crops now started to be introduced to the Africans, started to be introduced in Africa. So that again, it was a positive what a reform. Another one, we also see that new farming methods they were also what are introduced. So that on its own now it advantaged the Africans in the sense that they were now practicing agriculture, growing new crops that were introduced by the abolishment of slave trade. What about the social effects of abolishing slave trade? Number one, there was the spread of westernization. So Western civilization it had to spread. What are we talking about in terms of education? Schools were built. What about Christianity? We see churches also are being started. So we see Western civilization are starting as a result of abolishing slave trade. Another one was that there was the introduction of the new architecture in terms of a brick lane. We see that there was now machinery for brick lane. There was also stone building starting in so many African states. So we are seeing that the introduction of architecture was another positive reform, a result that was brought about by the abolishment of slave trade. Again, we talk about the building of schools, the building of colleges, the building of hospitals, the building of clinics. By these missionaries, Africans benefited by the building of these institutes. By so doing, we are saying that the abolishment of slave trade it brought some positive results. Then we also talk about the issue of teaching. Africans they were now taught to read. They were now taught to write. New what technologies brought about good improvements to the Africans. Books, they were now printed in local languages. Africans could now read in their local languages. So we are saying that Africans, they benefited by the abolishment of slave trade. Then we also talk about development of new culture. A new culture also developed in terms of clothing. What the Africans were now clothing, it now changed. They were used to clothe animal skins, but now they were even now clothes. We also say that the food also changed. We also talk about the drinks that they were taking also changed. The music now that they were listening in also now changed. They were now listening to Western music as opposed to the traditional music that they used to listen. Then we also talk about the negative effects in terms of social what effects of abolition a slave trade. For example, erosion of African culture. Our African culture, it was eroded by the abolishment of slave trade. Then we also see that there was development of classism, development of classes. New classism started to exist. We now had the nobilities, those who were wealthy, or the capitalists. We now also had the middle class, and also the peasants worked for those who were wealthy or rich. So classism started to exist by the abolishment of slave trade. Then let's move on and talk about the political effects. Number one, we also see that new states were formed, new countries were formed by the abolishment of slave trade. For example, talk about Sierra Leone. It was a new country that started by the abolishment of slave trade. Liberia is also another country that came by the abolishment of slave trade. Then also talk about colonization of Africa, African colonies, African states. So many countries, so many states now, they were now colonized. They were now under the domain of the Europeans. The Europeans were now dominating what was taking place in Africa. So we are saying that slave trade, it brought about colonization of Africa. Then also talk about the Africans. They also lost their political power. They no longer had power over their people. They were now puppet leaders. They now danced in accordance to what was wanted by the whites. So we are saying that slave trade, it brought about loss of power by the African leaders who were no longer independent to deliberate, to pass decisions that benefited the people. Instead, they now danced in accordance to what was wanted by these whites. So these were some of the effects, the economical, the political, and social effects of abolishing a slave trade. Thank you so much. It's Dr. Muso.